It seems like this week is relatively calm, but there's still a lot I want to discuss with you.
Well, well, I would not agree, actually. And this is something that's perhaps a lot been widely missed, but the Russians have been coming under a lot of pressure, it seems, from India and Brazil to begin negotiations with Ukraine. And they're getting annoyed about this. And the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said, he made a certain public comments to India and Brazil, who apparently are asking Russia to agree a ceasefire. And they say, why do you not understand the situation? We've explained it to you many times. Ukraine is incredibly dangerous to us. They are persecuting Russians in Ukraine.
Mhm.
Look at China. Look at President Xi Jinping, who's understood the situation much better and has made certain comments about how, in order to resolve a problem effectively, you need to approach it by examining its root causes. And these are public comments that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has just been making. So it's the first time I can remember when the Russians have criticized Brazil and India, and I think mostly these criticisms are up towards Brazil. He did this in during a conference in Saudi Arabia. He said that the Brazilians and the Indians have been coming to us and saying, why don't you consider a ceasefire at this time? And it doesn't make sense to have a ceasefire at this time because Ukraine has shown no interest in addressing the underlying questions, problems of the war. And Lavrov has also said that you should learn, India and Brazil should learn from China's position, where President Xi Jinping and the Chinese have shown much more profound understanding of the conflict and have said publicly, and it's there in all of their plans and proposals, that in order to resolve this problem satisfactorily, you have to look at the underlying causes and have to address and deal with the underlying causes. And only if that happens will you come up with a just and sustainable solution. So, this is the first time that the Russians have criticized fellow BRIC states
Mhm.
publicly. And in this case, it's India and Brazil. And it's very interesting that they're contrasting the stance of India and Brazil with China's. And I can actually find you Lavrov's words. They're quite long, so
Mhm.
but they are there on the in the foreign ministry. Um, he says that today I discussed this topic with my counterparts from Brazil and India because they display a certain concerned approach, one that we understand to facilitate crisis resolution. I drew their attention to the fact that it is the persecution of Russian people in Ukraine that is the key problem. We are urging them to focus on this. We discuss this with our Chinese friends too. No success will be achieved unless we get to the root of the problem. In this context, we appreciate the Global Security Initiative announced by President Xi Jinping, which says that it is necessary to start analyzing any conflict from its prime causes. This refers fully to the Ukraine crisis. The prime causes will go for good if they are laid bare and condemned. So it's the first criticism by Russia ever of BRICS friends. They're going out of their way to say India and Brazil are their friends, but they don't really understand the problem. And look at China. China understands it so much better, and you should learn from our friends in China and look at what President Xi is saying. It's an extraordinary statement from Lavrov, and it follows similar um, criticisms, very veiled criticisms of Brazil and India, which have been made by President Putin himself.
Yeah, I also think, yeah, I was thinking that that something similar, but not as as the clear, yeah. Well, I do find that both
Yeah.
India and Brazil probably they're a little bit too eager to play this mediator role or something. Being a good mediator actually it's a hard thing, isn't it? I think if you look at the how China mediated this rapprochement between Iran and the Saudi. The thing about that is China sees both sides are serious. Both Saudi and Iran are seriously wants to have this negotiation, have to improve the relationship, and that's when the mediator can come in saying, "Okay, come here, let's talk this through." But in this case, in Ukraine and Russia, I mean, Ukraine doesn't have a serious. I mean, I can't see anything indicate that seriously they want to talk because if they seriously want to talk, they can talk. Right? And then without the seriousness from the Ukraine side, just ask Russia to have a ceasefire. That seems to me like very it's not going to be productive at all, isn't it? That they're very eager to be the mediator or something.
You are absolutely correct. Both Prime Minister Modi, who suffered a setback in his recent election, and President Lula are very, very anxious to achieve some great diplomatic success, which they can take to their people and tell them, look how what a great leader and what a tremendous diplomat I am. It isn't like that. Now, I should explain, I have been a mediator many times myself in my previous work. When I used to work at the Royal Courts of Justice, I was asked by the parties to act as a mediator many times. And that can only work when both parties ask you to become the mediator. It doesn't work at all if you want to become the mediator and tell each side, well, look, I'm here. Why don't you accept me as mediator? That isn't how it happens. The other thing about being a mediator is that it must be done absolutely privately. When we discovered that China was acting as mediator between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we discovered that China was mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran after the mediation was successful. It was all conducted completely privately. And again, coming along, so Modi going off to Kiev, Lula making his various public comments. That is not how mediation is done. What you have here, this is the fundamental difference. And I think India, in India, by the way, there's been a lot of criticism within India itself of what Prime Minister Modi has tried to do. And I think Prime Minister Modi is going to change tack fairly quickly. I think he's embarrassed by this. But I think India, Modi doesn't understand mediation very well. And I don't think that Brazil, Lula, has an understanding of what mediation involves. And I'm going to say, I don't think Brazil has the depth of diplomatic skill that China does, which enables China to conduct mediation. India does, by the way. India has some very capable diplomats, but I don't think Brazil does. I think that they're very new to being an important country. They want to establish themselves very fast. President Lula apparently has his own internal and domestic problems. He's coming under some pressure from the Americans. Brazil and India have been working together on this. And I suspect that it's President Lula, more even than Prime Minister Modi, who is behind this thing. And as I said, I think it's already failed. And it's been done just a few weeks before the BRICS summit in Kazan. And I get the sense from these words, and I didn't read all of Lavrov's words. Some of them are very pointed in their criticism, and Putin's still more so, by the way. I think what has happened, all that they've managed to do, is annoy the Russians.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. Yeah, and but sometimes I do think countries, in particular, if they think they are rising, they very quickly wants to
Yeah.
take part in international affairs and play a very important role. That, but everything has its time. I think in China we say, patience is virtue,
Everything
right?
has its
Yeah,
well, indeed, everything has its time, and
time.
patience
Yeah,
is virtue,
yeah.
especially in diplomatic discussions. You
Hmm.
mustn't rush these things.
Yeah,
You have to wait. And of
yeah.
course, you can tell each side, look, if you want to talk to me, if you want to look for a solution, well, Xi Jinping went about it the right way. He spoke out, he set out principles last year.
Hmm.
He appointed Li Hui,
Yeah,
that he's there. If
yeah.
either side wants at some point to talk,
Hmm.
they can talk. But coming along and presenting your own ideas, one of the first rules of mediation is you do not present your own plan and your own ideas. You don't come along and say, well, why don't you have a ceasefire? You don't do that. That's not what a mediator does. A mediator is not somebody who comes up with a peace plan. It
Yeah,
is somebody who facilitates diplomacy between the parties.
yeah. Let them come up. Yeah, with a solution. Yes. Yeah, that they both can
With
accept.
their
Yeah, in the
solution.
end, it has to come from them. Yes.
Yes, yes. It has to
Yeah.
come from them. You can
Uh-huh.
help them. You can
Yeah.
provide a means of communication. You could try to steer discussions. You could
Hmm.
look for common ground, but it's a long, slow process. It'll between Russia and Ukraine, especially so, and certainly not the way it can't be done in the way that Brazil and India want it.
Yeah. Um. Okay. Since we're talking about Ukraine, um, I even want to ask you this last time. So these two Russian ballistic missiles, they struck a military academy in Poltava and
Poltava,
followed
Poltava, yeah.
Poltava. Okay, and that followed by this foreign minister, Swedish foreign minister resigned. Now the Chinese media has been over this discussing and saying that the Saab, which is I guess, military contractor from Sweden, and the Saab instructors were among those people being killed. There are many people being killed in that. The official numbers it's not true. There's way more than the official numbers, and in particular, Saab has instructors. The number the Chinese media said it was like a 37 or maybe more. Saab instructors were killed, and that was the main reason the Swedish foreign minister Tobias Billström that he resigned. But that's not how the Western mainstream media reported. What's your take on that? Are those two things related?
Well, they are related. I'm going to say straight away, the Chinese media are getting this right. I was uncertain initially about who was telling the truth about this story, but I think the cumulative information that's coming from Sweden is that this is absolutely what happened, and it seems that Saab, which is it's a big company, but it's a Swedish company. It's not a giant corporation. This has been a devastating disaster for them. I mean, many of their best people have been killed or wounded in this. And the other thing was conducting this training exercise, if that's what it was, in a place like Poltava, which is in eastern Ukraine. It's east of the Dnieper, well within range of Russian missiles. And bringing together all of these people in this one place was unbelievably reckless. And for the record, the Russians basically agreed with the Chinese account. I mean, the Russian account is very similar to the Chinese account.
I think that's where they
And
got
what the
there.
Russians basically
Yes.
are saying,
Yeah. Mhm.
well, probably they had intelligence. They almost certainly knew these people were there
Yeah.
already. But what the Russians are saying is that the Westerners, the Swedes and others, had this assumption that the very fact that there were Westerners in these sort of buildings would somehow deter the Russians from launching strikes, whereas that might have been true at the start of the conflict, but by this point, the Russians are now so angry with the West, and they feel that the West is so hostile to them that instead of the Russians holding back from launching attacks on positions where the Westerners are known to be, the Russians, on the contrary, are now targeting them. They're actually hunting the Western advisors and technicians and are attacking them wherever they can.
And yeah, and I also think it also makes sense because there isn't any official reason the foreign minister resigned. He didn't give even like health reason, family reason. He didn't even say that. He wasn't there very long.
Yeah.
And he also, I would say, the only thing he achieved during his tenure is to push Sweden into NATO. And it's very reasonable to believe those people, the Saab employees. I mean, remember these, if it's true, it seems like it is, these are civilians. If they are Saab employees, right? They are not soldiers. They are not military officials. For them, for their families, these people are just having a business trip. And then all this happened, like
Yes.
these people just dead. I would think the families would want some answer, right? Want some accountabilities. And that could very well be the pressure for him to resign, I think. And now we don't get any confirmation of all that. And then the Swedish, I read the Swedish media as well, that they are denying this is true, but they don't give a lot of explanation. The deny is very simple. Oh, that's not, there's no foundation for that. That's it. They don't explain anything else. So I think it's very reasonable to assume that this is probably the reason, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm not 100% certain it is the reason, but as you correctly say, why else would this thing have happened? And the Russian reports, at least, were coming out and saying that there were Swedes there and that a lot of Swedish people were killed before the Swedish foreign minister resigned. So there is clearly a policy in the West to deny that deaths, when they happen, of Western technicians, scientists, advisors, military people, are connected with the fighting in Ukraine. Sometimes all kinds of stories are put about that some so-and-so died in an accident or a heart attack or something like this. But as many people are now pointing out, there's all kinds of unexpected deaths, unexplained deaths starting to appear. And I suspect that this is what happened in this instance, in this particular case. The West is starting to pay a price in terms of its people. They are now starting to die in Ukraine. And this, I think, is having an effect. It's having an effect on in Germany, where the Germans are now talking about the need for peace. Perhaps it will soon have an effect in Sweden as well.
One thing I want to share with you, that there was some political commentator in China. They were explaining Sweden as a country, because I particularly interested in that because I spent many years in Sweden. So what they were saying is that Sweden as a neutral country, why it changes policy, right? If you look at the history of Sweden, it has this profound scare for Russia all these years. So whenever Russia is very powerful and Sweden feels threatened, Sweden will say, oh, we're a neutral country, we're a neutral country. And then whenever Russia is weakened, the Sweden will be more like working with the West and insert itself and showing, even though they claim they're still neutral, but they, basically working with NATO, etc. for many years. And now they see their final opportunity. Okay, NATO it seems to them that now is the opportunity that Russia is so isolated. So now they officially join NATO. So that, do you agree with that assessment? Because if that's true, I think that's probably explained to me, because I always wondered, 200 years neutrality works so well for Sweden. Why do you change that? But maybe for 200 years, it was never truly a neutral country. It just adjusts its neutrality policy based on Russia. Is that true?
You are absolutely correct. One of the things to say about Sweden and Russia, I don't know how true this is at the personal level in Sweden, but the Swedes and the Russians have never liked each other. There's never been a time that I can remember when the relationship between these two countries has been actually good. During the Second World War, it was fairly well known. And I mean, this is official history. I mean, it's in Britain, it's openly talked about. In Russia, it's openly talked about. I suspect in Sweden it's not. But it's fairly well known that at various stages in the Second World War, until things started to go badly wrong with the Germans, the Swedes were quietly assisting the Germans in the Baltic, that the Swedish Navy was tipping off the Germans about what the Soviet Navy was doing. And of course, they were exporting iron ore and machine tools to Germany throughout that time. So this is something the Russians, by the way, have never completely forgotten. And the Russians, I mean, I've never been to Sweden myself. I don't know Sweden so well, but the Russians believe this goes all the way back to the early 18th century, when Sweden was in control of large areas of what is now Russia on the southern bank, on the southern side of the Baltic. And there was a long war between Sweden and Russia, in which Sweden was eventually completely defeated. And the most important battle, by the way, took place in 1709 in Poltava, which by coincidence is the very same city where this missile strike happened. There was another Swedish-Russian war, by the way, in, I believe, 1810, 1811, when the Russians and the Swedes again fought each other. The Swedes at that time sort of in alliance with Napoleon. This is before Napoleon invaded Russia. And it was over the course of that war that Sweden lost control of Finland, which was transferred to Russia, and for about 100 years became a Russian province.
Yeah. Well, the World War II thing that you talk about, I think even in Sweden they admit that. And now, in terms of their real collaboration, how deep they were working with the Nazi Germany, they don't talk about that. But at least they admit one thing they cannot deny is that the German troops used part of the Sweden territory to get to Norway. I mean, they cannot deny that. They didn't tell the Nazis, no, this is my territory, you cannot come in. The Nazi Germany did go through, Sweden. So that they cannot deny that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, lots of things has its explanation. I was always puzzled. Why do they change this thing that they worked so long for them? But maybe it never was a fully neutral country. I think deep down, like you said, they probably have.
Well, the Russians don't think that it was. And I'll say this, when Sweden chose to join NATO, the Russians accepted it. I mean, they said, look, Sweden has never been our friend. It's always been our enemy. We understand that. The thing that really hurt them was not when Sweden joined NATO, but when Finland did. Because after the Second World War, the Soviet Union and Finland became very close. The Soviet Union invested very heavily in Finland. It helped Finland rebuild its economy. The Soviets, the Russians, thought they had a good, stable, friendly relationship with Finland. The Russians, the Soviet army, the Red Army had defeated Finland, which was allied to Germany in the Second World War, and had been on the brink of occupying all of Finland. And it didn't happen because Finland ended the war and promised the Soviet Union that they would remain neutral forever. And the Soviets accepted that promise and developed this long and very deep relationship. And they now feel very angry and very betrayed about it. Finland has made a huge mistake. Sweden, I mean, as I said, the Russians never really took Swedish neutrality especially seriously. Yeah. But Finland, they not only saw as neutral, but in a certain sense as friendly. And I don't think they will forget that, and what they see as a betrayal, and forgive it very easily.
Yeah, I also agree that Finland made a huge mistake. I also think that Sweden made a mistake by joining the NATO. They will regret this. And in fact, I think even the polling number at the time, majority of the Swedes didn't want to join NATO. It's the Swedish government push for this. Yes. Yeah. The
That's
other thing,
absolutely right. Yeah.
yeah. The other thing is Ukraine is talking about they want to involve 150 countries in a peace summit, and this time they said they want to include Russia. You see, I don't quite get it. You know, you're having so many countries. What's the purpose of so many countries? We do have a saying. You probably have something like that too. You can't have too many chefs in the kitchen, isn't it? I mean, what's the purpose of so many countries?
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, what the Ukrainians are trying to do is they're trying to organize a peace summit in which everybody puts pressure on the Russians to stop the war. This is why we're going back to Brazil and India. This is where this whole situation has arisen, because you can see that the Ukrainians and probably the Americans too have been telling the Brazilians and the Indians, let's all go to this peace summit. Let's have a discussion there. Let Russia come too. And let's tell the Russians, look, this has gone far enough. You've proved what you made your point. Let's have a ceasefire. And after that ceasefire, then we can start talks. I think this is really what the Ukrainians are trying to do, what the Americans and are trying to do. And as you rightly said, the Brazilians and the Indians, who are very keen to appear like, you know, the great mediators, and Lula and Modi want to show that they're the big friends and supporters of everybody, and that they're great international spokesmen. They've been trying to go along with it. And the Russians are telling them, this isn't going to work, because we've been here many times. We've actually agreed in the past ceasefires with the Ukrainians. We did this twice in 2014 and in 2015, and it didn't work. And we did it again, by the way, in early 2022. And we thought we'd come to agreements with them. And it turned out that those agreements meant nothing. And in fact, all that the Ukrainians are really trying to do is that they're trying to stop the war, because they're losing the war. And then they're going to come back with the same old demands that they always make, that they want us to withdraw from every part of the territory that Ukraine possessed when it became independent in 1991, and only then and only then will they talk about the important issues. And that is clearly unacceptable for us, and we're not going to do it. So that's what the Russians are telling the Brazilians and the Indians, and you can see what the Ukrainians are trying to do. They're trying, in effect, to isolate the Russians. It isn't going to happen.
Yeah, but then my question is, okay, they are trying to get everybody to put pressure on Russia. But what if Russia doesn't show up? I mean, they say this time they want to include Russia, but what if Russia doesn't show up? And I'm not sure how many of those 150 countries would be interested in coming as well. I mean, if it turns out the Russian doesn't even show up, and then not that many countries truly interested in this, isn't that going to be another embarrassment? Kind of like
Well, it is. It is going to be another embarrassment, and it's going to be another flop. And I think the other thing that, you know, people sometimes do need to understand is that in a war, in a conflict, sometimes situations arise where negotiations really aren't the answer. And I think Ukraine is becoming that one. The reason is that it's always that the Russians haven't tried negotiations many times. The problem is Ukraine has never been interested in good faith negotiations. So when that happens, the only way war can end is when one side or the other wins. And this is what's going to happen this time.
Yeah, I think the problem with war is that you supposedly you already tried to negotiate, trying to find a solution, not to get into a war, right? Find a solution to a problem. But once the war starts, it's almost always you need a winner to emerge before it can end. I mean, unfortunately, once the war starts, that's just the way it is, right? I mean, if it could have been resolved without a war, it could have resolved. But once the war starts, it's always somebody has to emerge as a winner.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, I agree. Yeah. And speaking of which, I don't know if you see this interview. This guy, it's a Russian guy. I think his name Mikhail Zygar. he interviewed Victoria Nuland. Mikhail Zygar is a Russian dissident. And did you see that interview with
Yeah,
Victoria
I did
Nuland?
see that interview. I did see that interview. I was quite astonished by it, actually. Though I've also said in my own program, I shouldn't be astonished, not by the kind of things Victoria Nuland says. In fact, I'm surprised at myself that I'm astonished. But nonetheless, I was astonished at how absolutely brazen she was about the fact that the United States was instrumental in wrecking the agreement that had been reached in Istanbul in 2022. I mean, it really, I mean, it made my jaw drop, actually. I mean, she's obviously proud of what she did.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's fascinating, I find that interview absolutely fascinating because almost like everything she says contradicts somebody or something. For example, from the very beginning, she's trying to make it very clear that she doesn't have much of a Russian roots. I think that's contradict what one time Gonzalo Lero's talking about her and saying, part of the reason Victoria Nuland had this, hatred towards Russia is because of her Russian roots and believe the pogroms and, have hurt her family, etc. So she contradicted him on that. And then the other thing I thought was very interesting is that she's talking about how much US supported Russia once the Soviet collapsed. Well, that's contradict what Jeffrey Sachs said many times. Jeffrey Sachs, he's the guru of this shock therapy. And he was successful with Poland with this shock therapy, but it was successful because US put in the cash to save Poland from all the inflation, all that coming with the shock therapy. But the US absolutely refused to do that with Russia. Jeffrey Sachs talked about that a lot. And Victoria Nuland was saying, oh, we helped Russia and this and that. So she contradicted Jeffrey Sachs on this one. And then the other thing is that she's saying, okay, through IMF and through World Bank that we supported Russia. And even she claimed that World Bank could forgive Russia for the loans. I checked. That's never happened. In fact, both World Bank and IMF made it very clear that they normally don't forgive any loans from any sovereign country. So she contradicted IMF and World Bank. You see, so every point that she's talking about it, like she's contradicts somebody or some organization or something. I find that's absolutely fascinating.
It is extraordinary, and well, that's again, you're absolutely right. I mean, she makes all these extraordinary, brazen statements, and she's straightforwardly lying. The World Bank, as you rightly say, does not write off loans. It's not constitutionally able to, nor is the IMF, by the way. I mean, that's a fundamental principle of IMF lending. IMF loans take priority over other loans and cannot be written off. So, in fact, the Russians paid them all back, every single one of them. And of course, when in any argument about what actually happened in the 1990s, whether the Americans were supporting Russia at that time, I always go with Jeffrey Sachs. As you rightly say, he was there. He was the point man. He was speaking to everybody. He's discussed this many times. I should just mention one quick point for your viewers that Victoria Nuland is now an academic at Columbia University in New York, where, of course, Jeffrey Sachs is also an academic at Columbia University, as you pointed out to me. So they're colleagues, and it's fairly well known that they intensely dislike each other and have no time for each other. So it'd be very interesting sometimes to see what goes on in the common room when the two meet. But anyway, there it is.
Yeah, and do you think Victoria, I mean, throughout this interview, even though she's smiling, she's soft-spoken, but I do get the feeling that she very much hates Russia. I just get that feeling.
She does. I don't think there's any doubt about this.
Yeah.
I mean, can I just say, I mean, it's just to go back, the moment the Russians at the end of the 90s told the Americans to go away and started to deal with their problems themselves, that was when things in Russia began to improve. Up to that time, the Americans were there and things were only getting worse. I mean, that's the historical fact. Now, as for Nuland herself, she clearly dislikes Russia. Why? she dislikes
Yes.
Russia.
Well,
To the extent that she does, I mean, it's a bit of a puzzle. But I suspect that in spite of her denials, her roots, which are Jewish roots in Russia, where Jewish people had a bad time, I think it must play a significant role.
yeah, and that's what the Gonzalo Lira was saying. Gonzalo Lira had an
Yeah.
episode just talking about that, and
Yeah.
the program that her grandfather, I guess, and grandparents and came to the United States and had a hard time here to adopt, to adjust to the new life and et cetera, which may, cause lots of pain to the family, for them to reestablish in a new place, new country, and that caused her father's psychological problem, etc. So I think there has a lot to do with that. And it's
Yes.
probably not just Nuland, but some other Eastern European, Russian Jews has some problem with Russia.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And and the one thing that this guy, Mikhail, he was mentioning something of he said that he think Putin wants to have some kind of a Yalta kind of a summit to have US and China and sit together to make some kind of arrangement, a little bit like the Yalta conference thing. And Victoria Nuland said, "Oh, we cannot do that. Then we cannot just override all the small countries, etc." But what I find that's she totally dismissed this idea. I don't know if that's even true, but the reason she totally dismissed this idea is that she wants the U.S. to control everything, the U.S. to decide everything. Isn't that what it is?
Well, of course it is. I mean, Nuland, of all people, talking about, the small countries and the concern for small countries, and the United States, suddenly showing all this concern about small countries, even as they're trying to engineer color revolutions in Georgia and all kinds of other places. I mean, as I said, it is utterly brazen at so many levels. But Putin has never proposed any kind
like
of
that.
conference in the style that Nuland and this man were talking about. I mean, there's never been a suggestion that there's some kind of Yalta, sit down being talked about, because it's very important to separate the actual Yalta conference, which took place at the end of the Second World War between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And by the way, de Gaulle was also there. And the actual conference and the legend, because of course the legend is what Nuland was talking about in this program, where the Americans and the Russians, or to be more precise, the British and the Russians, cynically divide up Europe, and the Soviets thereby are given free rein to occupy and conquer all of Eastern Europe. That was not what was discussed at Yalta. That was absolutely not what actually really truly happened at Yalta. One of the things that they agreed at Yalta, for example, was about the setting up of the United Nations. This is something that nobody ever really talks about, but the breakthrough about the creation of the United Nations happened at Yalta. But as I think we discussed in another program, the main focus of Yalta, when it was clear that the war was going to be won, was what to do about Germany. And the idea was to divide Germany into zones and administer parts of Germany. Each of the various countries would administer their particular part of Germany, all in preparation for the peace conference, which would agree the peace treaty after the Second World War, which was supposed to come. So all of these provisional arrangements were put in place at that time, but they were never intended to be permanent in the way that, Western myth making says, because always the expectation, not just it was what everybody assumed would happen, that like every other war, there would be an international peace conference. All of the great powers would be present, including, by the way, Germany, where there would be elections in all parts of Germany, democratic elections to elect a German government. And as at that peace conference, all the countries would participate and would agree a permanent peace. And as we know, that never happened. And it was not because the Soviets didn't want it. It was because the West didn't.
Yeah. The other thing also, I noticed that actually, in fact, that the US is, because there's never a permanent solution. So whatever happened afterwards became permanent, right? That Germany has been basically permanently occupied by the US. So,
Yeah.
and the same thing happened with Japan, right? And so, but it does seem like the US is loosening up the control of German to fight Russia. So one of the things that I don't see a lot of reporting, but Chinese media has been discussing, is that there's German fighter jet has been carrying a nuclear bomb under its fuselage. It was spotted over the U.S. So what happened apparently that they were spotted outside the Edwards military base, and some people just saw them and then took pictures, and they saw them, and so those pictures started floating. And then the German government came out and saying, yes, that's true. We are doing some drill, something like that. But those are one-to-one nuclear bombs that they are practicing. That's very alarming, isn't it?
Oh, it's incredibly alarming. And of course, at a time like this, when there's all these tensions in Europe, um, the Russians, I mean, the one thing that is going to alarm Russia more than anything else is Germany acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is almost this is a step in that direction. By the way, it won't be just with the Russians who are alarmed. A lot of other people are going to be alarmed as well. But here we see it happen. I mean, again, one does wonder whether these people who are doing these things fully understand what it is that they're doing, what memories they are, creating, they're ignoring. The fact that German tanks and armored vehicles have been operating in Kursk region, for example, in Russia, where there was a massive battle between the Red Army and the Nazis. And we've had Ukrainian soldiers dressed in Second World War Nazi uniforms with Nazi helmets and all of that. And no one in the German government shows any worry or concern about this. No one in the West does. Of course, for every Russian, this reawakens memories of a very alarming time and hardens feelings there that this means that these countries, the Western powers, seek Russia's destruction.
And the more we talk about it, the more I feel like we do need some kind of a peace summit or some kind of a discussion to really settle all these things. Because for one thing, Germany should be a sovereign country. Right now, it's not. It's very much controlled by the US. I actually want to see Germany and Japan, for that matter, to be a normal country. They are not a normal country at this point.
No.
Right? And they are within, for example, Japan, the military wing of the country is more or less encouraged by the US. And the same thing with within Ukraine, there is also this Nazi faction, neo-Nazi faction within Ukraine that is also encouraged by the US. I feel like we actually do need to have a real discussion and settle all these issues, have some kind of plan to let all these countries become truly independent, sovereign, normal country.
Well, absolutely. That absolutely ought to be the ultimate objective of world foreign policy. I mean, and I think that if you were to sit down with Wang Yi or Lavrov and you were to say that, they would completely agree with you. Unfortunately, and this has to be said, at the moment, the Western powers are absolutely opposed to this because Western policy is block confrontation. They want to create a network of alliances. They want to preserve Western hegemony. Boris Johnson openly talked about maintaining Western hegemony. So, and of course, that means controlling the two former Axis states, Germany and Japan. And that's what the objective of Western foreign policy has been, American foreign policy. And it has been ever since the Second World War.
It's just so interesting. There are quite a few other interviews that's also interesting. So one of which is Tucker Carlson was interviewing I think he called himself a historian, Daryl Cooper, Daryl
Yeah.
Cooper. Yeah, and the reason I paid attention to this because the mainstream dismissed him. You know, they saying he's some kind of a weirdo or something. But then I got interested, so I look at that interview. It's a long interview, and in that interview, one part's very interesting. He said he thinks Winston Churchill is a villain. Now that's what got the CNN to dismiss him. I want to see your view. What's your take on Winston Churchill? Do you think he's a villain?
Right. The interesting thing about Churchill is that I was in Britain when he died, and I can remember his funeral. I was
Yeah.
there, and it was a huge event in Britain when it happened. And I was 4 years old, and about a year ago, I found the old footage, and I discovered to my astonishment that it was exactly as I remembered it. So, I have that memory about Churchill myself. Churchill is the giant figure of British 20th century history. And it must be said, there's two things to say about him. First of all, he was a racist imperialist. That there is absolutely no question at all. He came from the absolute core of the British aristocracy, this small ring of aristocratic families that controlled British power and British foreign policy from about the 17th century until very recently. He was absolutely one of them, and his mission, and he was the dominant figure in British foreign policy, in Britain, not just Britain, in Britain. He was the leading, most important political figure in Britain from about 1920 until his death in about 1960. So, a period, 1965. So a period of about 40, 50 years, he dominated British domestic and foreign policy. He's one of those people, even when he was out of power, because of his family connections, because of the force of personality that he had, because of his very real intelligence, he was always, even when he was out of government, he was always in power. That's an important thing to say. And his objective, his purpose was to preserve British power and to preserve the British Empire. Because through preserving British power and preserving the British Empire, he also preserved within Britain the ascendant position of his own class. Now that is what Churchill was all about. And along the way, of course, he was very racist. He was intensely socialist. He was, because, of course, the British Empire was an empire based on a conception of white supremacy. We must have never, brushed that away or forget about it. So he was all of those things. And his major problem with Hitler and with Germany was the fact that he saw Germany as a potential rival to Britain and a threat to the survival of the empire that Britain, was at the center of. So that's his motives. Those are his motivations. He was a brilliant orator. He was an incredibly skillful politician. He was an outstanding diplomat. Undoubtedly the giant figure of British 20th century history. But that was what he was ultimately about. It was a reactionary, backward-looking attempt to preserve an imperial system that was starting to collapse. And he prolonged it very well. He played, as some people have said, a weak hand with great skill. A person like this can still sometimes do real good. And by opposing Germany and Hitler when he did, and making sure that Britain opposed Germany and Hitler and Japan, he made sure that Britain was there with its empire and its resources, fighting Germany, German Nazism, and Japanese militarism at the right moment. So he's this person. When you say that when people say, did he save democracy, and was he a racist imperialist? Up to a certain point, he did save democracy, but he was also a racist imperialist. Was he a villain? Well, at some level he was, because he was absolutely open about what he was trying to do, which was preserve the British Empire and the British system. But did he at the same time play a significant role in the 1940s in resisting forces which, if they'd succeeded, would undoubtedly have created a dark age? And by doing that, did he create new conditions in the world, in Europe, in China, across what we now call the global south, which led to the collapse of the empires, including the British Empire, that he had worked so hard to preserve? Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He did have that positive contribution at the same time. One of the things people don't know about Churchill is that towards the end of his life, he became increasingly depressed. He became very, very worried that Britain had become too closely allied to the United States. He felt that Britain urgently needed to regain its freedom of action. He tried to negotiate an end to the Cold War in the early 1950s, which was by then far too late. And towards the very end of his life, he was telling, when it was clear that British Empire was ending, he was telling everybody, in everything I have attempted, I have failed. So he went to his end believing himself to be a failure. So that is my view of Churchill. So, a complicated and difficult person to understand. But if you understand who he was and you look at his class and his origins, it's actually not that difficult.
That's pretty much more or less what Darren Cooper was saying. Now, one can say then that he is a defender of the British Empire, but ultimately he failed. One can say that because after World War II, Britain, the empire did collapse pretty much, right?
Yes.
But I guess at the time, what he was thinking, because Germany is this threat, he didn't like the Soviet Union either. So his thinking is to pull in United States to fight Germany and then get the Soviet and everybody, all these three big countries that potentially are the threat to the British Empire. They fight amongst themselves, and then they will be weakened. I think that's the idea, right? Isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it was. It was the kind of game that it needed a Churchill to play. I mean, he did have that enormous diplomatic skill and force of personality, but of course, when he was gone, and he lost power in the 1940s for a time, and in the 50s, he was a significantly weakened figure, as of course Britain was. Then, of course, the Americans, the Soviets, began to think of their own plans. And of course, China emerged at that time, and India gained its independence. So the world eventually left him behind. He was a very bitter and unhappy man at the end of his life. If you read accounts of him at the end of his life, you realize what a sad and miserable person he had become. As I said, I have failed in everything that I sought to do.
Well, don't you think Britain is almost making the same mistake now? Because the idea for the Ukraine and the Russian war is to weaken Russia. But once the war is over and Russia emerges victorious, it will only make Russia stronger, just like World War II. After the war, because US and Russia, Soviet, they are the winners. So they emerge as more powerful, stronger, right? They replaced the British Empire. Basically, that's what happened. Isn't it? So they're making
This is absolutely correct. This is absolutely correct. Now, this is where, of course, we have the problem of the myth of Churchill. I mean, one of the things that Churchill did, of course, and he did it very, very systematically and very intentionally during the Second World War and after, he created a massive personality cult around himself. I mean, the British tell you they don't do personality cults. It's absolutely not the case. Margaret Thatcher had a kind of minor personality cult, but the big one is Churchill. I mean, your books, films, all sorts of things that make Churchill into this colossal, heroic figure. And what has happened in Britain is that the British political class, which remains very much under the spell of Churchill's personality, and it is, I mean, the extent to which the British talk about Churchill, especially conservative politicians talk about Churchill, is astonishing. The number of films that are still produced about him in Britain, the number of books that are still written about him in Britain, they, as I said, remain under the spell of Churchill. And they try to continue what they believe his policies to have been. Whereas the actual Churchill, one of the reasons he was such a formidable political figure was that he was very analytical. He was, by the way, very hardworking, very efficient manager. I mean, people always imagine that, because he spoke in a funny way and wore funny clothes, that he wasn't, but he was actually extremely hardworking, very efficient, very fact-based, very interested in understanding the leaders on the other side. He would have completely rejected the foreign policy that the British today are conducting. He would have said, this is completely wrong. What he would have wanted was something completely different. He would have said, look, the Russians have their interests in Eastern Europe. We can't resist them there. We need to have the Russians as a balance to the Americans. He always had some issues with the Americans, by the way, contrary to what many people think. We need them as a balance, and we've got to keep this balance there. The idea of winning a victory against the Russians, he would have said, is ridiculous. And he would have said exactly what you have said. The outcome of any such attempt is that it's going to make Russia much stronger, and it's going to make Russia hostile to us. That is, of this I have no doubt, because I've studied Churchill, but anybody who does history in Britain has to. I have absolutely no doubt that that is the approach that he would have taken. But of course, it is far too intelligent and sophisticated for the sort of people who run things in Britain today.
Yeah, they have a very simplistic view. Okay, it's good that you have your fight because then you're weakened, right? But they have to learn their own history, But if somebody emerges as a victor, victorious, and then that country will be stronger. I mean, it has been proven repeatedly. If you look at the Korean War, I mean, before that, China was regarded as, oh, it's a poor country, even though it's big and with many people, but it's weak, It is after the Korean War, everybody was like, wow, that China actually can win against so many countries. This is a whole new China. That was the Korean War, right? That was not intended by China, but in the end, that was the result.
It's very interesting that you bring up the Korean War, because we now know that Churchill in private had great doubts about the wisdom of the Korean War. And when he became prime minister again in 1951, he basically wanted to find some means to bring the Korean War to an end. Because again, he thought that this was very misconceived and ill-judged. And this is the period in the early 50s when he was trying to end the Cold War, because he saw the Cold War as a trap for Britain, which was limiting its scope for political and diplomatic maneuver, and which, as a result, was facilitating the collapse of its empire, which, as I said, was what he wanted to preserve. He's a complicated man. He wrote massively, by the way. He's one of these people and he spoke continuously. So it's actually not that difficult if you really want to research him to find out what he really was about and what he thought. But of course, many of the books he wrote were intended to promote his own personality cult, and did so very successfully. He wrote a massive multi-volume history of the Second World War, which should be avoided at all costs. It's all about Churchill and what a genius he was, and how he fought the Germans single-handed, and how everybody else played just side roles. And about China, he basically has nothing to say.
The debate last night. What is your take on the debate between Kamala Harris and Trump?
A completely empty theatre. Yeah. But I mean, the thing to say about it is that, again, and I'm going to focus again on Kamala Harris because she's the person who's over promoted again. I mean, she said nothing of value or of substance at all. The entire pitch of the debate was to try to humiliate and anger and irritate Trump in some fashion. And well, up to a point, she was successful in that. But then so what? I mean, Americans know Donald Trump by now very, very well. They know the sort of person he is. It's not going to change a single vote. This is my own view.
Yeah, I agree. But I do think Trump has a certain disadvantage because Kamala Harris is, I mean, even though she has been the vice president, but she is a lesser known because she's not as prominently reported and investigated and all that kind of thing. And also, as a woman, I find that Trump sometimes is not as aggressive as he was against Biden. If it's with Biden, he can say anything, he can, but this is a minority woman. It to a certain degree, it limited a little bit his attacking style. Which he's very good at. I think Trump is good at attacking, but I do think that's kind of a limiting for him. But I agree with you. Even though overall, I actually think Harris did better than I thought, than people anticipated. She didn't just burst into laugh all the time and doesn't have much to say. She does seem well prepared, but I agree with you. It's not going to change any people's mind. But I do think there's a certain disadvantage that the Trump has, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the major mistakes he made, in my opinion, was agreeing to another interview hosted by another television station that is fundamentally hostile to him. I mean, I think he could have insisted. I mean, I think he did a program with CNN. I think he could have insisted, look, I did it on CNN. They're very hostile to me. The next one should be on Fox. If you don't want to do me on Fox, then frankly, I'm not interested, because you're only prepared to talk to me when it's all stacked on your side. And I agree. I think he has institutional problems. First of all, you're quite right. He finds it difficult to attack a woman and a minority woman. I think that is absolutely correct. And undoubtedly, he was told in advance of the debate, don't do that. And perhaps that was the correct advice, actually. I think that if he'd come out too aggressive, it might have led to some unfortunate headlines for him, which this time he's avoided. I mean, here's one thing to say. And the other thing is, of course, the moderation, as is always the way, was very, very biased, I felt, always towards Harris. But people will say that she did better than they expected. A lot of people are saying that. The fact is, she was incredibly carefully prepared in advance. You could see that they planned and prepared this to the last detail. But she didn't say anything in the end that will, that will stay in the public memory. A week from now, it'll all be forgotten. It's not like, the big debates that happened on other occasions, the famous one where he said, Mr. Quayle, JFK was my friend, you're not JFK, or Nixon, Kennedy way back in 60. I mean, it wasn't that kind of a debate. I mean, she made Trump get angry. But we all know Trump, is a thin-skinned individual who sometimes gets angry. It didn't in the end change this lack of anything concrete about Kamala Harris herself.
Yeah. One thing, actually, there are 2 points I think I would say work towards Trump's advantage. One is she said her economic plan is so good that even Goldman Sachs endorsed it. I'm not sure that's a good thing for Harris because
No.
they're supposed to represent, the public. I'm not sure endorsement from Goldman Sachs she should be talking about. So I think that's a big mistake from her. Trump really played that, I think, if Trump is smart. The other thing I think Trump said in the end was very good. He said that all these things that Kamala Harris promised you that she will do, she could do it now. She could do it now. Why doesn't she? Right? I think that's also a good point from Trump. So that's a big punch, I think.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think that's the theme that he's going to play, because of course what Kamala is trying to do, what Harris is trying to do, is she's trying to be the anti-incumbent incumbent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this very odd situation. Of course, I mean, it's happened in many elections. I remember back in, well, I can't remember when he was elected, 2015, that Macron ran as the the outsider, the anti-establishment outsider, when everybody could see, who wanted to see, that he was entirely an establishment insider. But with Harris, she is the vice president. It's the Biden-Harris administration. I mean, if she wanted to do all of these things, that she could have done them.
Yeah.
But of course, and she's not breaking with Biden either, of course.
Yeah, well, her slogan was a new way forward or something like that, which seems to me like you deny what you're doing now for the past 3.5 years is the wrong way, right? So that's why you need a new way, is it?
Precisely. Well, that's exactly right. Yes. I mean, this was why she tried to sort of heat up the temperature, because her messaging ultimately is bad, and it's the sort of messaging which goes against the mood in the United States today.
Yeah. So, yeah, talking about which, so in the meantime, there is more than 200 like Bush, Romney, McCain alums. They have been writing an open letter to endorse Harris, right? At the same time, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and even Tim Walz's own brother, they all endorsed Trump. Is there a new political realignment going on here?
I think this is the single most important thing, and I think you put your finger on it, because you're absolutely correct. What we see is the political class closing ranks, be they nominally Democrat or nominally Republican. It's the political establishment, the old establishment that has governed the United States for decades and has brought the United States to the happy position it is in today, versus all of those who represent the dissident, alternative, critical views, who's looking at the situation and they're saying, look, this doesn't work. What we're doing can't continue like this. Some of us perhaps self-identify as being on the left. Some of us perhaps self-identify as being on the right. But the most important thing at the moment is to break the hold of the political class. And that's what we're starting to see. This is the division in America. That, by the way, goes straight back to your point about Goldman Sachs, because by talking up about how Goldman Sachs supports her, again, Kamala is basically saying, I am on the side of the establishment, of the big people. That's why I want Dick Cheney to support me. That's why I want all of these people to support me. So, whereas Trump doesn't want any of those people, or at least if he understands his politics, he doesn't want any of these people. He is fighting upwards. So he wants the support of the Tulsi Gabbards, the RFKs, Walz's brother, people like that. And I think that's exactly correct. That's the big conflict in the US today.
It's pretty amazing because talking about Dick Cheney, I think at one point Hillary Clinton couldn't stand Dick Cheney.
No.
She even, with one interview, I remember she was saying that Dick Cheney, with his motorcade, came over something, and here came out, Dick Cheney, the Darth Vader, that was the description she used to describe Dick Cheney. And now, like, they are
Mm.
happy family, Cheney openly come out to endorse Kamala Harris. I find that stunning. I find the whole thing
Yeah,
is just absolutely stunning.
I find it absolutely stunning. I mean, given especially what what not just Hillary Clinton, what the
Mhm.
Democrats used to say about Dick Cheney. You read, I mean,
Yeah.
there was, I remember there was a film. It was actually rather shocking and I think inappropriate film that was published at, towards the end of Bush's time as
Mm.
president, George W. Bush's time as president, which is the assassination of George W. Bush. And it was all about what would happen if Dick Cheney became president of the United States. And it was, roundups of everybody, World War III instantly. And you're absolutely right. He was being presented at that time as a cross between Himmler and Darth Vader. I mean, it was terrifying. And now, of course, we embrace him. He is this, sensible, rational, level-headed Democrat, the man who was behind, the torture in Abu Ghraib, as we used to say then. He's suddenly now, of course, all that's all forgotten. Now he's protecting our democracy, from the forces of darkness, which are actually Donald Trump and his cohorts. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to see the change.
Sometimes, I mean, not sometimes. I just think politics is very sinister. I don't know. It's just yeah.
Well, it
Uh,
is sinister. It is truly Orwellian.
yeah.
Um, uh, Oceania is at war with Eurasia. Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia. Everything that contradicts that is what they say memory hold. So you don't talk anymore about Dick Cheney being Dick Cheney, the kind of Dick Cheney that was. He's no longer the most sinister and dangerous vice president in US history. He's suddenly become this virtuous Democrat who's coming to the rescue of the Republic. This kind of manipulation of history and of memory is unbelievably sinister.
Yeah. 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 Okay, about China. So, quite a few European leaders are visiting China.
Mm.
The latest one is the Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre. I think when he landed in China, the Spanish Prime Minister hasn't left yet, Pedro
Mm.
Sanchez.
Mm.
What's your take on that? Yellen also seems like talking about visit China again. So, what's your take on all this?
Right, there's two things to say. I mean, I come back to your point, which we made in one of our programs a short while ago, that Beijing is now the center of international diplomacy. It's the place everybody wants to go or needs to go. They all need to speak to the Chinese leaders, to Wang Yi, to Xi Jinping, to the Chinese Prime Minister.
Yeah.
They all need to go there. I think that there is another major factor at play, and that is that we are now starting to see stronger and stronger signs in the West of a major economic recession developing. It's not exactly clear when the economic storm is going to hit, but I think there's a growing sense that it is coming. So we had that wobble in the summer. We had more problems in the stock markets last week.
Yeah.
There's reports the British government is going through a major program of tax rises and government spending cuts, which have shocked the Labour government supporters. And we've also seen a fall in the price of oil, which is a sign that economic activity is falling. So all of this is happening. Now, once upon a time, leaders in Europe, especially, looked to the United States to take the steps to resolve the problems in the global economy. They're gradually coming to understand that the United States cannot any longer do that by itself. So they are going to China. Now, in the case of Europe, there is another factor, which is that Europe has been, and this is difficult for Americans, I think, or it's even more so maybe for Chinese people to understand. Europe has been in a period of around 15 years of stagnation, of recession and stagnation. There's been no growth to speak of since the 2008 crisis. Living standards are probably lower than they were before the 2008 crisis. There's a growing understanding in Europe that we are falling behind in all of the key technologies. AI technology, Europe has never developed its own digital platforms in the way that China and the United States, and by the way, Russia have done. I mean, notice Telegram, Russian platform. There's nothing analogous to that in Europe. So the Europeans sense that everything is not going well, that their economy is stagnating, that they're far behind in motor vehicle production, and the Chinese are now the world leaders. I read a report about this, and it contrasted the situation with motor vehicles, not just in Europe, but across the West, between the Western ones and the Chinese ones, and the extent to which China has now has fully understood and gotten on top of EV technologies and how to operate them. So Mario Draghi, who was the former head of the European Central Bank, has now come up and said that Europe needs to spend 800 billion euros a year over 5 years to try to upgrade its technologies and its industries in order to achieve American technological levels, because we're falling behind. The Americans falling behind everyone else. Realistically, the European system is far too dysfunctional for the Europeans to be able to do that themselves. So they have to turn to China and hope that the Chinese will do it for them, because they can't do it themselves. So this is why they're all going to China at this time.
But there seems like there's some divisions. So one thing that Pedro Sanchez did, seems like after his visit, he wanted the EU to drop this tariffs on Chinese EVs. Now, part of it is because China actually had a countermeasure against Spain's pork. Pork export is very important for Spain, of course. Yeah. And so I think that's part of the reason. But in any event, that seems like that, because it's EU who want to have tariffs, high tariffs on the Chinese EVs, but it seems Spain and possibly, I think even Germany was against it. So there's a division within EU, yeah. Isn't it?
Yeah, there is, absolutely. I mean, well, here we see the EU doing, which is one of the reasons why Europe is in the disastrous situation that it is. The EU is doing what the Americans want, which is it was the Americans who perceive Chinese EV technology as some kind of a threat, just as they perceive Chinese developments in AI technology as a threat. So that's why the Americans have imposed tariffs, or are talking about tariffs on EVs, and why they got the Europeans to do the same. And it isn't good for Europe, because Europe is so far behind here. And Europe is going to have a massive problem developing its own EV technology. Volkswagen is now talking about closing its own factories in Germany. Yes. I mean, that kind of thing. What they need to do is to work together with the Chinese to develop win-win partnerships on this. Some European leaders understand it, but the EU centre is opposed. And that checkmates every attempt to try to develop these partnerships, which are the partnerships which Europe needs to make in order to move forward.
Hungary has been is working with China to have Chinese investment to build a EV factory in Hungary. So Hungary is one exception. I think they should do more. Maybe Spain wants that too. I don't know, but I really think, like you said, instead of putting tariffs, just working with China, to have some entice Chinese EV companies to do investment, right? That's what they should be doing, like Hungary. Yeah.
Absolutely. You are completely right. That's exactly what they should do. But at the moment, they're not only not doing that, they are literally doing nothing. I mean, there was an extraordinary comment that was made by an EU official who was critical of EU policy. He said, America innovates, China replicates. That isn't true, by the way. But anyway, put that aside. The EU regulates. That's all it knows how to do. About China, that is completely wrong, and it is based on a complete misunderstanding. But about Europe, it is true. Just to give again, because Russia's the country I know about a year ago, I read a plan that the Russians have about sorting out their own chip production in Russia, because Russia imports chips and it imports the technology to make chips to the extent that it makes chips itself. And they produced a very, very well thought out and a very realistic plan. They say, look, we're far behind in some of these technologies, but we need to start working to get them sorted. They appointed a leading company, which is Rosatom, the nuclear power monopoly, to lead the project. And you can see that step by step, they're actually moving in that direction. So this year, they started producing commercially their own lithography machines. Now, these are old. These only manage, was it 350 nm? So this is a technology that China developed 10 years ago. But the point is that they are now starting to make their own lithography machines. They're looking to have lithography machines that will bring that, the topography down to 28 nm by about 2027, 2028. So they're step by step, they're working towards that. They also understand that they need to have partnerships. So Putin went to Malaysia, which is an important producer of chips, and they're going to work with the Malaysians to some extent. And of course, they're going to work with China too. And they're also looking at new technologies around photonics, and they want to interest the Chinese in all of this because they say that might be ultimately an alternative to the Dutch-built, extreme ultraviolet lithography machines and all of that. But look, the point is, they have a plan.
Yeah.
They're working towards executing that plan. China, of course, does that on an immensely bigger scale because it's got far bigger resources. The Americans do things in their own muddled and chaotic way, but because they have so many resources which they throw in, sometimes something comes out. The Europeans are doing nothing. They're not doing anything. And that's the tragedy.
Not only they're doing nothing, I think the Dutch government wants to ban ASML from serving already in service a lithography machine in China.
Absolutely. That's exactly what they want to do. I mean, the idea is, again, that the only ASML can produce extreme ultraviolet lithography machines and other lithography machines, which guarantees that in 5 years' time, China definitely, Russia possibly will be producing analogous lithography machines. That's all that does.
Yeah, they give China no alternative other than just rely on China itself. Yeah,
and
it's just utterly stupid.
It's utterly stupid. The idea that China cannot do it, the biggest manufacturing country in the world, with the biggest scientific and technology base in the world, which it does now have, and enormous resources, and they're able to draw on their friends in Moscow for all the raw materials that they need, argon, fuel, and all that. That the idea that they cannot do it is stupid.
Yeah. And the other thing is happening also, just to share with you that China reacted very quickly to Canada's tariffs on EVs, on Chinese EVs. Remember, Justin Trudeau came out quickly after Blinken, Solomon's visit and saying, okay, we put 100% tariffs on Chinese EV. For one thing, now his argument is to protect Canadian EV. Canada doesn't even have an EV company. I mean,
I was going to say, what Canadian EVs? What Canadian EVs are you even talking about? He wants EVs. He wants EV factories in Canada. Get the Chinese to build them. That's the obvious thing. But
exactly.
no, of course, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And China reacted by conducting an anti-dumping investigation on Canadian canola. So it hurts the farmer. It got some farmers really angry. You can see on TikTok, they were making, they were totally very upset about this whole thing, because it's very hard for them to change it now, because everybody's waiting for the canola seeds to produce in the oil. So they cannot start a grow new things, right? And so in essence, what Justin Trudeau is doing is to, in the name of protecting a industry that doesn't exist in Canada, they are destroying their own canola oil industry. This is absolutely insane.
It is stupid, but again, he's just doing what the Americans want him to do, because the Americans they want to stop Chinese EVs, and so they're getting the Canadians to put tariffs up in order to protect, as you said, a non-existent industry. The only industry, ultimately the only EVs that the United States wants to see sold in the West are its own. That's the truth of it.
Yeah, but it doesn't have, I mean, other than Tesla, it doesn't really have
a lot of.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's far behind in this area. And I'm going to say something about Tesla. I think Tesla is losing it. I think Musk himself is really losing interest in this. I mean, he built up Tesla. He managed hugely well out of Tesla. But I think now his major priority are his space ideas. Well, all credit to him. He's done really well. But I mean, the fact is, if we're talking about EVs, the real center of gravity of development is China.
Yeah.
Everyone can see it.
Yeah. And it's so remarkable that Justin Trudeau doesn't seem to learn any lesson. Remember when he kidnapped Meng Wanzhou, angered China, China immediately arrested 2 Canadians. And he was shocked. Apparently, he was totally unprepared for that. And this time again, they were totally unprepared that China would hit back with the canola. I mean, what do you expect? That China just do nothing? They seem to don't learn.
They don't learn. They absolutely no. You're completely correct. I mean, I've seen this. I've seen this myself in Britain, by the way. All kinds of advocates in Britain, individuals in Britain, including one particular television radio commentator. I can't remember his name, but anyway, it's on the tip of my mind, but I can't remember it. Anyway, they were advocating all kinds of sanctions on China because of things that were supposed to be happening in Xinjiang region. And the Chinese slapped sanctions on them, including on this person. And he was furious. How dare they do this to me? I mean, it's, I can advocate it. I can demand it against China. But when they do this to me, it's outrageous. It's shocking. And, well, there we are.
Yeah. They're still living in this mentality. They can do whatever with no consequences. But China, Russia, they do something. Oh, good. My goodness. How dare they, right? They're still living in this mentality. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing before I let you go. I want to ask you about this Mike Lynch death. It on the surface, it looked like a Robert Maxwell's death. So what's the big interest about that? It seems like, I mean, why the British media are so fascinated by it, other than it's a mysterious death of a rich person?
That is an excellent question, because I'm not sure I myself fully understand. As I said, a not particularly likable man. That was my own personal view. A very, very rich. He'd just been through a very complicated court case. He built this extraordinary, unbelievably extravagant yacht, a 56-meter yacht. I mean, I know a lot about yachts because, of course, I'm from Greece, and that's the world a certain type of yacht. For a Mediterranean yacht, that is huge. That is a huge yacht with this incredible mast and all the rest. And it all went wrong and it capsized and it hit probably a tornado. And, it's a tragedy. But why this morbid, obsessive focus on this story for day after day after day? I'm to some extent baffled by it. But I think there might be sort of glimmer of an explanation in that, of course, the British also like to believe that they're, great technological, they're at the cutting edge of technology. And Mike Lynch was the closest to a sort of Bill Gates figure. I mean, that's an absurd way of putting it, but it's the closest to that we have had in Britain. And I mean, you can't really compare, not in any objective way, but he'd been built up in Britain as this great tech entrepreneur that Britain had, the one that, proved how technologically advanced we are. And then, of course, he dies in this extraordinary way.
All I can say is when I see these kind of things happen, I'm just very happy we're not that rich. I'm happy to be a regular person. We don't need yachts and jets and all those things. It just seems dangerous to me. So I'm happy that I don't have that.
Well, can I just again, because I mean, this is just. Greece is, of course, the world of yachts, and in former days, I used to be invited onto them, and I used to see them many times. A yacht of this size, it seems to me, and of the kind of yacht it was, it isn't suitable for Mediterranean conditions. I mean, the right yacht in the Mediterranean is a much smaller motor yacht, so that you can go up, hopping from one island to the other. He had a Caribbean yacht, a yacht designed for the Caribbean, floating around the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean is a very tricky and complicated sea. It has abrupt storms and strange things happen. It's not as predictable as the big ocean is. So you need a yacht that is better adapted to its conditions. But he was a rich man. He had lots and lots and lots of money. He wanted the biggest, the boldest, the tallest yacht that he could afford. And he got that one. And he clearly didn't check the crew properly, the pilot, the captain, and things of that kind. Probably. I ought to also say, I mean, I'm going to make a guess that these people perhaps are more used to the yachts that are more suitable for Mediterranean conditions than this one was, I should say. So anyway, the whole thing probably was ill-judged and misconceived. And I agree with you. At the end of the day, if you want to paddle around in the sea in the Mediterranean, there are much cheaper and safer ways to do it.
Right. Yeah. I'm happy to be a regular person without all,
Absolutely.
because everything you own, it's just extra trouble, extra work. You have to take care of it. You have to maintain it, insure it. It's endless work, it seems to me. So.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I'll tell you something again. I mean, I don't really frequent these circles anymore, but, I came from a family in Greece that was very well connected. So I met lots of the very rich people in Greece, the ship owners and all of these people, the people, some of them, in the international rich class. And the thing that struck me about them invariably was how miserable they all were, how incredibly unhappy. I mean, it was a thing that I never completely understood, but they were all very, very miserable and unhappy and stressed and worried and afraid, very, very frightened people nearly all the time. Afraid that something would happen, that they would lose their money in some form. It was, despite, and they would try to buttress to fortify themselves from their insecurity by piling up possessions, yachts and villas and more yachts and still more villas and all of that kind of thing. And it struck me that it was mostly intended to make them feel, more secure than they actually felt. And of course, all it was doing is exactly what you said. It was creating more and more things for them to worry about.
Yeah. Okay, with that, let's talk again next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Sophia.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.